Doug Sparks joins us here today on the Siliconimist. Doug is the CEO of M2N Technologies, LLC. But he's fun thing we're going to talk about. He spent more than a decade in China working on semiconductors and MEMS manufacturing. First, thanks, Doug, for joining us. I know you still travel a lot, but I'm assuming you're at home in Indiana, judging by the pleasant background you got there.
Yeah, I am. I'm digging out of our big snowstorm, the snow apocalypse that hit the eastern United States this weekend.
Good. Well, I'm glad I could relieve you from a little bit of the shoveling. Thanks for chatting with us. Here, talk a little bit. I just finished your book. It was fantastic, really interesting. And I think we overlapped a little bit together in China. We were doing different stuff, but you say you spent over a decade. I think it was maybe 14 years or so living and working in China inside the semiconductor industry. You saw it all from the inside out. And most people, myself included, we try to understand China's semiconductor strategy from the outside, but you saw it from the inside, often at a very senior level. So as you point out in your book, also, I thought it was really interesting. You had a line there saying that because the restrictions passed and your time there ended, you may have actually been one of the last U.S. executives working there. So that's a pretty interesting place to start. We're going to start at the beginning. How did an American executive end up inside the Chinese semiconductor industry in the first place?
Well, it all started, I met a lady who was born in China at a trade show, Sensor Expo in Chicago. And she said, "Hey, I like you as a manager. I want you to help me start a big wafer fab in China." And she had been a designer for me, chip designer for me at Delco Electronics, which was a GM division, doing automotive, development and wafer designs. And we both left there and joined startups. And she actually was my first customer at my startup, which was called NanoGetter. So we did vacuum packaging for people. And then we didn't see each other for 4 or 5 years. And then I saw her at this conference and took me out to lunch. She pitched me this job, said, "Hey, you can come over. I need somebody with some talent that knows how to manage, knows how to develop products, knows how to run a fab, start up a fab." And I had never been to China before, and it really sounded cool. It'd be a big opportunity. I figured it'd be a 1 to 2 year project. I traveled a lot in Japan and in Europe and places like that, but never China. So I thought, yeah, I'm gonna check it out. And they flew me out there. I got to meet all of their, the corporate executive who ran a huge conglomerate, and met the management team and thought, yeah, I'm going to give this a try.
A little bit of drinking and a little bit of socializing later.
There was a lot of drinking. And I'm not a drinker.
You got the first of many dinners, I bet, on that trip. So
yeah,
that's really cool. So this person worked for you. Was she an executive when she came in and tried to recruit you, or
she was?
She just had you in the Rolodex?
It's several U.S. MEMS and sensor companies, big ones and startups, and she was the CEO of the new Hanking Electronics division. That was the division that I was working for, and so I was hired as her executive vice president.
Interesting. What year would you have started going in with? That's 2010 or 11?
2011.
2011. Was the focus of that point would have been on, like, not necessarily cutting edge, but like real bread and butter MEMS sensors for what?
Yeah, at that time, China really didn't produce any MEMS products outside of research labs. They imported everything. They didn't have a large wafer fab for MEMS, so this was the first 200 millimeter, 8-inch diameter MEMS fab to be built in China. So it was. When I visited, this was in northeastern China. It was like a cornfield, so it looked like Indiana. Acres and acres of corn. It was a greenfield site, and they built a wafer fab there over about 5 years.
Oh wow, jeez! I thought like one of the most useful parts for this was I had read about Big Fund, all the big funds. It sounds like you came in in the middle of Big Fund too, right? So one of the most useful parts is kind of like how you walk through the different phases of China's big semiconductor push. Was the Big Fund 1 would have been before you showed up, and then you kind of lived through Big Fund 2?
Big Fund 1 started a few years after I showed up.
Okay.
And it was interesting to see, in the headlines of like the newspapers, when they just started building up interest in Big Fund 1, they would run all these IC self-sufficiency charts, saying, hey, we're at 5% now and we need to be 40. And then another editorial would say, we need to be at 70% self-sufficiency. And, that just seemed crazy optimistic at that time, because there really, other than SMIC and H.H. Grace, there weren't a lot of big fabs there at that time.
And when they talk about self-sufficiency, how are they measuring it? Is it just percentage of semiconductors they consume that are made inside the country, or do they run it some other way?
Initially it was primarily chips that would be built inside of China instead of imported. That was
Hmm,
the initial goal. After Big Fund 1 and 2, it became supply chain related because, CHIPS Act was passed in the US and everybody realized that it's not just wafer fabs, it's chemicals and wafers and materials and things like that. So, and equipment. So once the export controls started to get put on, ASML was the first one, their EUV system. By Big Fund 3, it was fab equipment oriented, and let's be
right.
self-sufficient in our own equipment because equipment's getting cut off.
Yeah. Big Fun 3 kind of came out, wasn't in response to the 2022 CHIPS Act, but it seemed like it was
It
pretty
was,
well
it was.
correlated.
So
It
Big
was.
Fund, it was interesting. Big Fund 1 and 2, then you saw this stories about corruption. So there were all these executives who got Big Fund money and used it to invest in their own stocks that they selected for Big Fund. There was all this insider trading and
Yeah.
things like that going on. So Big Fund 3 was going to be released, but then they had a anti-corruption drive, so it delayed it, and then it also changed it into equipment-oriented support.
Oh, okay, so I remember. I think I remember this, that it was like a year they kind of speed ran through a bunch of the fund 22, 23 just kind of stopped, right? Maybe there were a bunch of corruption charges and investigations. Yeah, I guess they kind of wrapped up everybody that might have been doing something with the fund. But do you think that was that just a case of like corruption catching up to the system, or was it really about like political favor shifting inside the party, or how did that feel?
It was
That worked.
primarily corruption. A lot of the stuff related to the party occurred right around Big Fun 1. So when President Xi took over, it was a couple of good years still. Then they started doing these anti-corruption drives, and it primarily was focused on, the CCP officials initially, but then it started trickling down into heads of private industry primarily. So there was a backlash against private, remember Jack Ma at Alibaba?
Yeah, yeah, I remember that.
When he had Alipay was so successful, they were doing more transactions in the Bank of China, and they
Yeah.
they clamped down on him, and he spoke out against that, and so he got put in the wilderness. But other CEOs were arrested, and if you were a private CEO, very successful one, a billionaire, you were somewhat deemed as a threat to the government. So there was some suppression from that standpoint, and that slowed things down.
Oh yeah, I remember I remember Jack Ma disappearing for a while, but it felt like that would have been that would have been before 22, 23. But it feels like that was kind of 2022 to 2023 was this like inflection point kind of between the US.
Yeah, it was. It was after
I know
COVID
it gradually
lockdowns.
kind of built up. Yeah.
Right. COVID lockdowns were used. COVID lockdowns pressured cash flow for everybody in China, including the semiconductor industry. And then it was used, there were other things that went on with private industries where they were trying to be harvested by state owned enterprises. So there was a lot
Yeah.
of strange internal things going on there that particularly impacted the private industry.
From your point of view, did it feel like that was a sudden break? Like I think maybe it kind of culminated between the U.S. and China when executives were banned from working on the highest level, at least, or the most advanced level in China. Did that feel sudden, or was that something you kind of just saw coming well before it happened and is
No,
inevitable?
it was gradual. Particularly, the most noticeable one was ASML, where at first they couldn't sell EUV systems. Then there were the advanced DUV lithography tools couldn't be sold. Then
Yeah.
there were no U.S. citizens or green card holders could go in China and do servicing. So that affected maintenance support and spare parts, and so and then I believe somewhere in that time frame, like Applied Materials, Lam, and KLA were prevented from selling advanced node tools to China. And so
Yeah, they
that
had to
really,
just abandon them, and yeah. Huh. So starting 2026, I guess, like 2016, with like the Trump administration doing what did they start doing? CFIUS interference, things like that, just kind of
yeah, yeah,
ratcheted up
that
from
was
there very
that
smoothly.
right. Prior to 2017, acquisitions by Chinese company was a way to grow their business and to get trade secrets and intellectual property legally. They would
Yeah.
acquire these small firms. Cepheus prevented them from doing that with Micron early on. Then, when the Trump administration took over, Cepheus really tightened the screws and basically shut down everything. In a counter, at that same time, China started shutting down acquisitions because of money laundering concerns. They were
Huh.
afraid that wealthy people in China were doing acquisitions and overpaying and keeping the money in accounts
Yeah.
overseas. So there was both ways kind of shut down the M&A, and that did slow one way of advancing in semiconductors in China, which was acquisition.
I mean, so as the American in the room, were you, it's like these things kind of rolled out and got tighter and tighter from that side. Did you just stare at your feet, or how did your Chinese colleagues take that?
Well, in my industry in MEMS, we don't work at advanced nodes. So
Yeah, I guess
that didn't
that makes
hurt us.
sense.
The advanced
Yeah.
nodes export controls. However, there were cases where if someone in your corporation was detained, then there was suspicion on the corporation and you couldn't get things out of customs. You'd buy tools from the US or someplace and they'd be held in customs and they wouldn't approve them, or they'd require huge payments or taxes to be made to get them out of. And they
Yeah.
were concerned that if you were purchasing things overseas, you were doing money laundering. So everything got
Yeah.
drawn out. Time scales, lead times went way out the roof because they were getting stuck at the border.
Yeah, it was another thing in the book that surprised me a little bit. I know China has capital controls, and I've sort of experienced that a little bit before, but it surprised me the shenanigans that you kind of talked about, where the capital controls became really constricting, like the things that they were restricting, or that some were doing to get money in and out of the country, and then how even like imports were kind of tightly inspected to make sure it wasn't part of a larger money moving scheme. I think you mentioned
Yeah,
whenever you moved a tool in, not only do you have all that hassle at the border with customs, somebody would come watch you unpack it and make sure it was
yeah.
actually,
And
a tool that
they would
worked and not some rocks.
yeah, they would come to the US or EU and they would watch you pack it up and make sure it worked when you
Really?
shipped it. Yeah, and then
Wow.
there was a whole group, a whole infrastructure, and then the similar people in China would watch. I thought they were going to open everything, but it turned out they just opened maybe 10% of the boxes and looked, and if they all were kosher with the list, then they said, "Okay, good deal.
Okay.
You can, we'll go away, and you can uncrate things."
How much of that, I mean, so it sounds like that became kind of a hassle towards the end, but how much of that, like, daily executive life in China was actually about navigating capital controls rather than, building the products or building the company? Was it full-time job?
It was critical. Yeah, it was critical to have executives that were well placed in the Chinese Communist Party that could
Well,
smooth
yes.
things
Yeah.
over. Yeah. It was critical to have good relationships with the banks that gave out loans. And then if there was a case where a company I was working for, the group CEO was purged from the People's Congress. So
Yeah.
after that happened, it was impossible to get traditional bank loans. And you had to go to shadow banking and these other networks of formerly disgraced CEO billionaires to raise money. It was kind of odd.
I think you mentioned was it you ended up eating, not you didn't, yeah, but the guy was known as Bear Paw. Is that right? Who was the?
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just more
That
and
was
more interesting people you had to deal with to get
our
money. But
joke. That was our
I know you were sort of like you were along for that ride in the company at one of the companies when they sort of fell out of grace with the CCP. And
yeah.
I love one of the other striking things was like you described the sort of like after dinner corruption stories, and that there's like that one line that stuck with
Yeah,
me
yeah.
about
That was like 2013 or 14, the first
wow,
year or two of President Xi's takeover. And there were so many corruption stories that I'd hear at dinner. Every
yeah,
Friday night, we'd all have dinner, and it would basically be who got arrested this week in the
yeah,
province. And then they'd say, "Oh yeah," they'd throw bags of money over his fence with a note pinned to them. Things that you just wouldn't even think about.
yeah. Yeah, so, and I think the officials getting airbrushed out of photos one by one. It's kind of there's
Yeah, yeah. And as they were
but
purged, the
yeah. Did you
pictures
ever
changed in the office.
look at that picture in the morning and think like, hey, I'm next. I should probably cash my chips and get back to Indiana at this point.
Yeah, I mean, COVID was a good reason for that. I mean, there was
Yeah.
a couple of times where they would take me to places. They would have, guards in front of the buildings, and I'm thinking, I don't think I should be in here. And I'd put a newspaper over my face as we drove through past the guard, and it's like, my
Uh,
son, he said, "Hey, Dad, this a retirement community, Chinese prison is not a good retirement
it's
community.
not.
So
Yeah,
you're
you're right, man.
going back."
Yeah.
But
It's so
COVID pretty much killed me traveling there in
yeah.
2020.
That's good. Tough to make those decisions. Like everything goes right until it doesn't in that kind of system. So,
Yeah.
um, so towards the end of the book, when you wrote it, at least, like the conclusion was pretty clear that like China's semiconductor industry was still meaningfully behind the U.S. and the allies, I guess. I was kind of wondering, we touched a little bit about it when you were talking about metrics from Big Fund, and they're saying percentage that self-sufficiency, I guess. But I was wondering, like, what we're kind of missing on our side, because when we look at the story through our own priorities, maybe China has others. Like if China's semiconductor industry were judged by Western metrics, like leading edge nodes, we talk a lot about, but maybe they view themselves as winning, or they sort of look at it through their own objectives.
Yeah,
Do you think it's
and they
actually
do. They
succeeding from their
clearly have
perspective?
they hit clear different strategic objectives than we do.
Yeah.
And they want to be able to run their own economy, which you can with 24, 28 nanometer and smaller. I mean, that's
Okay.
what we did, 10 years ago. So it's no problem to run your own economy that way. You can
Yeah.
satisfy the EV market. You can satisfy your exports. You can make military integrated circuits. You can make surveillance state devices. They make their own CMOS imaging chips. They make their own
Mm.
microphones. So they make their own
Yeah.
smartphones. They have AI networks. They can make AI, they make great AI tools with 7 nanometer nodes. And it's maybe not as effective or power efficient as the ones we can make at TSMC or Samsung or Micron, but they can still do it.
Yeah.
So, from their perspective, I think they've accomplished what they can do given the export control restrictions that they have. And from the U.S. perspective, and one thing I was always worried about, I used to get talks about this during COVID, was the glaring strategic um, vulnerability of the U.S. with TSMC and Samsung on the border of North Korea and China, and both
Yeah.
countries threatening to take those over. So we'd lose 90% of our advanced nodes. So luckily, we've been able to have TSMC and Samsung move state of the art fabs to the US and successfully start them up. Those are all things that people didn't think that were possible or economically viable 5 or 6 years ago, but they have been done. So there's two
Yeah.
strategic things that have been accomplished both from the US stand side and from the Chinese stand.
I hadn't thought about it, but you do kind of talk about that in your book, at least, of them moving things close to they move stuff close to the North Korean border. I think I'm mixing something
Yeah,
else up
yeah.
there. It was when North Korea was moving stuff towards the Chinese border to try to drag, um, if anything happened that would sort of drag China in as well, or make it think twice. But to your point, if you move a fab, or at least have a backup fab in the U.S., you move yourselves a little bit out of this like total standoff mode. You have maybe
Yeah.
more
I mean,
options, but
it would be an economic devastation if either of those countries would be, involved in a war.
yeah,
The fab
yep,
capacity in South Korea or Taiwan would be economically devastating in the trillions, but it would not be from a military or strategic standpoint. Now it would not be as great of an impact to the U.S.
yeah. Like, it gives some options, I think. So
Yeah, you
that's
have options
yeah.
now. You have some leading edge fabs in Texas and Arizona and in Oregon.
Well, so now we're 4 years into these export controls, and like 4 years at least into the really tight export controls. I guess we're almost a decade now, 2016, into start of export controls. I
Yeah.
think we've actually slowed China, like, or have they just redirected their innovation path and trying a
We've
new
slowed
new
China from
way?
advanced nodes because they can't easily just buy the tools from ASML, but they've
Yeah,
still been pumping billions and billions of dollars into mature node infrastructure, and they really have excess capacity now of foundries, and
yeah.
they're making their own tools for almost everything except advanced lithography.
Okay, interesting. I think you mentioned in the book too they might try to go the way of X-ray, or to go cyclotron generated
Yeah, they're
energy
they're
to do
trying all
that.
kinds of Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I mean, there's, the U.S. tried cyclotron lithography tools. IBM did, and the U.S. government built something in Louisiana, back in the
yeah,
90s, but it didn't work out. So that there's nano imprinting that can work for certain levels, which they have nano imprinting tools. And, Huawei and the government are funding, more conventional DUV type tools. They're trying all different ways to overcome this lithography barrier.
yeah. Well, so I know I just saw that. I think some of the chips money went to X-Lite, but they're doing X-ray. Like we're not exactly standing still on this either, I guess. But it's a matter of
Okay.
who
Right. Yeah, yeah. I
who goes
mean, yeah,
for it, you know. But yeah,
things change, materials change. technologies change and you relook at old old processes that were abandoned.
Yeah, that makes sense. Or other ways that you didn't go down. Coming back to China, like one of my favorite parts of the book was the food stories. I worked in China years ago, and I still remember walking into 7-Eleven for the first time in Shenzhen and buying vacuum sealed, like they were pickled chicken feet. So you could get them in like strips, and
Yeah,
and my kids and family were just amazed by them. I'd bring them home as, it probably wasn't okay, but bring them home as gifts, and they were just
yeah.
great
Technically,
fun
that would
things that
be
people wanted to be a part of or see and touch. But I
yeah,
read, and I remember reading this econ case study about it years ago. So I was really fascinated because it was like they talk about to illustrate why globalization worked, like with the explanation of how we benefit from trade. Like chicken feet are basically worthless in the US, right? So Purdue would
yeah,
export all of their chicken feet to China, much more valuable and delicacy. So it's kind of, it made me remember that story. I think just I'm sure Purdue made a fortune exporting all their chicken feet because we just don't like them there. But
yeah,
you wrote
yeah.
about things like luwak coffee, right? And we mentioned the bear paw guy, although I don't think you ever got that on the menu. But did can you get any of that in Indiana? Like, do you ever miss that stuff, or is that firmly
Yeah,
in
there.
the
I mean,
China
if you
only
go,
category?
like when I first started working there, I lived in Ann Arbor, and there were some, there's authentic, Asian stores and
Yeah,
restaurants. You can get chicken feet in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm
that
sure you
makes
can get
sense.
them
Yeah,
in most university towns or big cities that have a large Chinese population.
that makes sense. Awesome. Any good food stories that didn't make it into the book?
The one thing that when I first started working there for the first year, I lost 20 pounds because the
Wow.
smells, I just did lost my appetite. And there was this smell. They would boil fish and chicken bones to make the soup broth, and it would come out of a lot
Hmm.
of restaurants, and that would just about make me lose
Yeah.
it. So eventually, after 2 or 3 years, nothing phased me. I ate everything,
Yeah.
but like the stinky tofu, that was the worst food that I never adjusted to. Like the rotting tofu. And one time we were in Suzhou, and I got this food, and I thought it was grilled pita bread.
Yeah.
And so I took some, and I put it in my mouth, and my friend next to me was laughing. And it's like, oh my gosh, it was stinky tofu. It was fried, and it was like all hidden in this crusty brown, brown crust. And I thought I had some safe bread to eat, and that was a surprise.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I admire your sense of adventure there. I think a lot of people go and just try to eat the pork buns and stay away from everything else, And I guess at
I
some
ate
point
everything.
you
I
gotta
ate
dive all the way
all
in,
the
right?
insects and grubs and fish and
Yeah,
sea creatures.
that was another one. I was in Mexico. I ate a lot of. They had like fried crickets. Those were really good, but I don't remember. I cannot remember any insects in China. And you mentioned like you had a bowl full of fried caterpillars, which I'd never even heard of. So
Yeah,
that's
that
that's
was really
cool. If
common.
I go
It was
back, I
common. They were
gotta.
huge, bigger than your
Yeah,
finger. They were deep like French fries. And then there was these palm grubs that was quite frequent. And I used to, I actually liked them. They were like stir fried. They were salty, greasy. I used to joke that it was like a French fries wrapped in cockroach wings. Just had to get over the
sounds
texture, but they tasted good.
really know how to sell it. So yeah, just coming back to China and the U.S., I wonder how this ends. Like, do you see a stable equilibrium kind of between the U.S. and China in semiconductors, or in trade, or is the
I think
system
it can.
like,
I think it can
yeah,
happen. I mean, it may take 10 years for China to develop a reliable EUV replacement,
okay,
at which point we'll be roughly at parity with regard to semiconductor capacity and semiconductor capability. But I'm assuming we'll be making progress and we'll be down, to 1 nanometer by then. So I think right now China's satisfied to be fully self-sufficient in mature nodes, say below 7 nanometers. They can do everything they want to do.
yeah.
Maybe it's not quite as efficient smartphones as ours, but still they can have a perfectly functioning modern economy at 7 nanometers and below or above.
Hmm. Yeah, maybe not with the leading nodes and with I don't know. I feel like some of the conversation always comes back to AI, and I don't know if it's hype by people that are selling AI chips. I always suspect, but there's a point of no return or some sort of Rubicon that we go after, or we go over, and then one of us could never catch up or something like that. I don't know if it's a
Yeah,
fair
yeah.
portrayal of it, but hopefully we
That's the
can just
fear that
continue
either
to,
AI or quantum computing will
yeah,
whoever gets there first will run away with it.
just become so disruptive you never catch up.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, it comes down to the technology. So, like on a personal note, would you ever want to go back, or if you get the chance to?
I would like to go back, but it may require regime change before I can
Yeah,
go back. I don't know. I've been told I shouldn't go back.
yeah, that makes sense. Well, thanks for joining us. Your book is titled "A Decade in the Chinese Semiconductor Industry: An American Story." You really are that American. I feel like very few people have this vantage point, and feel like we're really privileged to have had you on and talk to you about it. Thanks so much, Doug.
Thanks a lot.